Temporary custody. No child support. 0. Read it carefully. There is nothing left for you to calculate.
You came here this late because you wanted no witnesses. You forgot something. I check every number before I trust it.
Naomi remains bent over the valuation model while cold rice sits untouched beside her keyboard. You're a calculator that learned to breathe. Preston straightens his jacket and walks toward the elevator while a waiting phone lights below. Naomi did not pick up the petition right away. She looked at the clock in the corner of her monitor instead, 11:52, and let the number sit there the way she let any number sit before she trusted it. The floor was empty enough that the only sound was the hum of the server room down the hall, and past that the faint tick of the elevator counting down from the lobby. Preston had not asked her to sign anything because signing was not the point of walking in at that hour. The point was watching her read it alone with no one there to witness what her face did. Her face did nothing, and that was its own kind of answer, the kind that had gotten her through 8 years of dinners, where his mother's silences meant more than her own sentences. She read the custody line twice, then the support line $0 a month formatted the way the firm formatted a rounding error. Clean final, no note attached. She thought in the flat way, she thought about numbers under pressure that a man does not write 0 unless he wants the number itself to be the message. No one else needed to see it because Preston had never needed an audience to make her feel small, only a room quiet enough that the smallness would land undisturbed. The petition ran 14 pages, and the last 3 were an exhibit list itemized in the same font his mother used for the seating charts she mailed out before every family dinner. It was a font Naomi had come to associate with decisions that had already been made before she was ever told about them. Exhibit C was the evaluation from Dr. Lang's office. 4 pages of letterhead she did not recognize despite 8 years of shared insurance paperwork. Exhibit D was a printout of her own calendar pulled from a shared family account. Preston still had access to 3 entries circled in red pen, none of them explained. She did not ask herself that night whether he had planned this for weeks or assembled it in a single afternoon because the answer would not have changed what she needed to do next. The order referenced a trust established for their daughter Maya, $186,400, set aside the year she was born. Naomi had never once withdrawn from it, despite 8 years in which she covered more than half of every bill that would not wait. Preston had control of that trust by virtue of a clause. She remembered signing without reading closely a clause his own lawyer had drafted back when she still assumed marriage meant the paperwork mattered less than the promise underneath it. The elevator doors closed on the reflection of a man who believed the hardest part of his night was already finished. Naomi set the petition on top of her keyboard, squared its corners, the way she squared documents she intended to keep, and reached for her bag without turning off her monitor. She had learned in the last 2 years of her marriage that the worst nights required her to look like a woman simply finishing a normal shift. On her way out, she stopped at the shared printer near the elevator bank. Its tray still warm, and found a page that was not hers. It had been left behind by whoever printed the psychological evaluation attached to Preston's filing. She did not touch it at first. She only read it standing there, and one line caught before her mind caught up to why. A session date, 3 weeks earlier, a Tuesday. She remembered precisely because she had been in New York that entire week for the Ashcom Due Diligence Conference. Badge scanned twice a day, hotel invoice on file, 700 people at the same conference who could place her in a different city entirely. She took out her phone and photographed the page exactly as it lay, corners uncentered, before folding it back into the tray, the way she had found it. Taking the page itself would only give someone a reason to say she had tampered with evidence rather than simply seen it. Then she wrote the date in a note on her phone. Nothing else. No explanation, because Naomi had built a career on the belief that a number written down early was worth more than a memory recovered later. She checked the printer's job log next, out of the same habit that made her check a spreadsheet's edit history before trusting its final number. The print request had been queued at 10:47 that same evening, 40 minutes before Preston walked onto the floor. The account name on the job log was not his. It belonged to a guest login Cole Holdings used for outside vendors, the kind of detail that meant nothing to most people and meant a great deal to someone who spent her days tracing where numbers actually came from. Blinds, still down at 2 in the morning, on the 9th floor of a due diligence room, Naomi Reeves was tracing a single broken link through 11 tabs of an acquisition model 5 years before any of this. The model had already been signed off by 3 separate analysts before her. She was 29, then married 3 years, and she had told Preston she would be home by midnight, a promise she had already stopped believing in, even as she made it. The error was small enough that anyone tired would have missed it, a formula referencing last year's tax rate instead of the projected one, compounding quietly across 42 rows. It understated the target company's liabilities by nearly $6 million. She found it because she read formulas the way other people read faces, unwilling to accept that something looked right without checking what it was built from. The deal was a mid-sized logistics acquisition, the kind that closed quietly and never made the trade press, and 3 senior analysts ahead of her in the review chain had already initialed the model as clean. Naomi rebuilt the liabilities tab from source instead of trusting the summary sheet. It was the way a professor had once taught her that a spreadsheet was only as honest as the person willing to open every tab. It took her 90 minutes to trace the error back to a single cell, a tax rate carried forward from the wrong fiscal year, referenced by 4 other formulas that had each compounded the mistake without anyone noticing. A man from the buying side was still in the room. Jacket off, sleeves rolled, running the same numbers from a different angle, because he did not trust a deal that had moved this fast. His name was Julian Hahn, and he did not introduce himself as anyone important. He only asked her whether the discount rate on tab 4 made sense to her, as if her opinion were simply the next fact he needed. When she showed him the broken link, he did not thank her, the way people thank someone for saving them. Embarrassment. He asked her 3 more questions, each one sharper than the last. By the 4th question, she understood he was testing whether the first answer had been luck. It had not been luck. And past 4 in the morning over cold coffee. Neither of them finished. He told her the firm would be lucky to have her. She told him without meaning it, as a door closing, that she was already taken. He nodded once, filed it the way he filed everything, and went back to the numbers. What Naomi did for a living was not glamorous. In the way people assumed finance had to be, it was closer to forensic accounting run backward. She built models that predicted where a company's numbers would break before they broke in public. At Ashcombe, she specialized in credit risk reading loan covenants, the way a surgeon reads scans looking for the fine print that told you a company was thinner than its balance sheet claimed. She could tell usually within the first 10 minutes of a filing whether a debt-to-earnings ratio had been massaged by moving one expense into a category that would not trip a covenant until later. It was a skill that made her very good at her job and very bad at ignoring the small inconsistencies in her own life, the kind Preston had learned to keep just out of her line of sight. She had risen to senior analyst in 6 years, the second black woman to hold the title at Ashcombe by being the person in the room who read line 11 when everyone else had already moved to line 12. It was not a talent anyone had taught her so much as one she had built out of necessity, the way people build most of the skills that end up mattering most. Julian remembered the meeting longer than he expected to, not because anything happened, but because so little ever surprised him anymore, and she had twice in the same night. 2 years after that room, and Capital hired her old mentor away from Ashcombe for a due diligence contract, and Julian asked almost as an afterthought whether Naomi Reeves still worked there. He was told she did, married now, settled, not looking to move. He did not pursue it because pursuing it would have meant something he was not in the business of starting, and he filed the name the way he filed everything else that mattered and could wait. Their paths did not cross again for 3 years. Not because Chicago's finance world was large, but because both of them were careful in different ways about which doors they walked back through. Capital by then had grown from a 6-person shop into a fund managing close to $2 billion, most of it in senior secured credit positions across the Midwest. It was the kind of lending that rarely made headlines because it was rarely dramatic. Julian's team specialized in mid-market companies that traditional banks considered too small to matter and too complicated to properly evaluate. It was exactly the gap Naomi's old mentor had once described as the most mispriced corner of the entire credit market. What neither of them tracked, because neither had reason to yet, was that a freight company called Cole Holdings was quietly restructuring its senior debt that same year. The name on the new majority lender's paperwork was Hahn Capital Partners, purchased by a junior member of Julian's acquisitions team, who had never once cross-referenced the borrower's ownership against anything beyond its balance sheet. Naomi never learned the name of the fund that bought out Cole Freight's primary loan because loan documents were Preston's business, a wall he had built early and defended without ever raising his voice about it. She would not learn it for another 11 months. Not until a Friday night on the 41st floor, when a phrase in an internal memo caught her eye for reasons she could not yet explain. 3 words sitting quietly at the bottom of a filing that had nothing to do with her Han Capital partners. Vanessa Kirk ran the printer. Logs the following Monday, a habit left over from her days doing internal audits before she became Cole Freight's chief financial officer. The log showed a badge scan at the shared printer at 11:54 the previous Friday, 4 minutes after Preston left the building, and the badge belonged to Naomi. Vanessa did not mention it to Preston that day. She mentioned it to Dr. Everett Lang instead, in a phone call that lasted 90 seconds and ended with a single instruction. Tighten the language in the report, make it read less like an opinion and more like a diagnosis. Dr. Lang had known Vanessa for 11 years by then, since a mutual client had referred them to each other at a wealth management conference. Their arrangement had grown slowly enough that neither of them thought of it as unusual anymore, the kind of drift that happens when a favor becomes a habit, without either person marking the exact day it changed. He billed Cole Holdings for consulting services twice a quarter, a category vague enough to survive most audits, and in exchange his opinions on family matters tended to arrive already shaped toward whatever outcome the company's legal team needed. What Vanessa did not know was that the page Naomi had seen was already photographed, dated, and sitting untouched in a folder on a personal drive Naomi had never once opened from a work computer. Preston. When Vanessa finally told him 2 days later, was not worried, because in his experience Naomi did not fight, she absorbed. She had absorbed 8 years of small corrections, about how she poured wine and which fork belonged to which course, and he saw no reason this would be different. He mentioned it to his mother that weekend in the same offhand tone he used for weather. She told him that a quiet wife was not the same thing as a defeated one, a distinction he did not think to ask her to explain further. On a Tuesday in November, Naomi's card was declined at a grocery store on Halstead, and the second card in her wallet was declined behind it. She called the bank from the parking lot, and a representative read her a note on the account. A temporary hold requested by the primary account holder, pending a change in structure effective the previous Friday. $214,600. Most of it built from bonuses she had redirected there instead of spending now, sat quietly out of reach. The hold had been placed using a power of attorney clause from a refinancing document she remembered signing during a kitchen renovation, back when she assumed paperwork was paperwork. The clause gave either party the right to place a temporary administrative hold on jointly held funds pending a change in account structure, a standard line most couples never read past. Preston's attorney had flagged it for exactly this purpose the same week the petition was drafted. The bank's own policy required 7 business days before either party could contest the hold in writing a window that meant Naomi would spend a full pay cycle unable to touch money she had earned. She did not call Preston. She called her own bank instead and opened an account he did not know existed, moving what little cash she could access into it before the end of the day. She used her maiden name on the new account, a small private correction that felt less like paperwork and more like the first sentence of a different plan entirely. That night she sat at her kitchen table and wrote down every account, every document, every date she could remember signing something without reading it fully, and the list was longer than she wanted it to be. Naomi did not confront Preston about the account, and she did not confront him about the printer page either. Confrontation in 8 years of marriage had only ever given him a script to perform on. Instead, she built a folder, the same discipline she used on every model at work. 1 tab for dates, 1 for dollar amounts, 1 for names. She populated it the way she populated any spreadsheet, slowly, without emotion, checking each entry twice before trusting it. She requested her own copy of Maya's pediatric and school record standard, enough that no one questioned it, and cross-referenced every date in the psychological evaluation against her own calendar, her badge history, and the hotel records from New York. 5 sessions, the evaluation claimed, spread across 3 months each one, supposedly documenting a pattern of what Dr. Lang's report called emotional volatility, inconsistent with stable parenting. 3 of the 5 sessions fell on dates Naomi could prove with a badge scan or a boarding pass that she had been somewhere else entirely. The other 2 sessions she could not immediately disprove, and rather than ignore them, she logged them separately in a column she labeled unverified, because a model that hit its weak points was worse than no model at all. She would spend 2 more months chasing down corroboration for those final 2 dates before finding it patience, being in her line of work simply another word for method. She began keeping a second, smaller notebook, handwritten, kept in her desk drawer rather than on any device Preston's attorneys might eventually subpoena. It was a habit she had picked up years earlier from a compliance officer who told her that paper left no login trail. Every entry carried three things: only a date, a fact, and the name of whatever document could later prove the fact. Nothing softer than that, no adjectives. Nothing that could be dismissed later as emotional rather than evidentiary. She printed nothing yet. She only built the file night after night in the 20 minutes after Maya fell asleep, and she told no one, not even Yvonne Marsh, the one colleague at Ashcombe, who had noticed she'd stopped eating lunch at her desk and started eating it in the stairwell instead. Yvonne noticed anyway, the way people who have survived their own quiet years tend to notice, and left a granola bar on Naomi's desk one morning, without a word, which was its own kind of message. The anomaly that caught Naomi's attention that December had nothing to do with her marriage at first. It showed up in a routine credit file crossing her desk at Ashcombe. A freight company called Cole Holdings flagged for a debt-to-earnings ratio that had crept past its covenant threshold 3 quarters running. She almost passed the file to a junior analyst before the name on the cover page stopped her. Cole Holdings, Preston's company, the one whose finances he had never once discussed with her. The ratio in the filing did not match the ratio she could calculate from public records, off by just enough to suggest an expense had been reclassified to avoid tripping a default clause. It was a trick she had flagged in other companies a dozen times without ever imagining she would recognize it in her own husband's numbers. She pulled the quarterly filings Cole Holdings was required to submit to its lenders and rebuilt the ratio herself from the underlying line items, the same way she had rebuilt the acquisition model 5 years earlier. The company had moved a recurring insurance premium into a category normally reserved for one-time charges. The change shaved just enough off the reported expense base to keep the debt-to-earnings ratio a fraction under the threshold that would otherwise trigger a lender review. She didn't know yet who held the debt, only that whoever did would eventually notice, because reclassified expenses had a way of surfacing the moment anyone bothered to check twice. She closed the file without flagging it to her own supervisor, telling herself it fell outside her assigned coverage. She knew, even as she told herself, that it was the first professional judgment she had ever quietly overridden for a personal reason. In January, a letter arrived at Ashcombe's compliance office, unsigned, printed alleging that a senior analyst had concealed a diagnosed condition affecting her judgment from the firm. The letter named Naomi directly and cited, without quoting it, a clinical evaluation. Compliance called her in on a Wednesday morning, and for 40 minutes she sat across from 2 people she had worked beside for 6 years while they asked her questions they had clearly been told to ask. Questions about stress, about stability, about whether anything at home might be affecting her work. One of them, a compliance officer named Robert, who had once covered a shift for her during Maya's first hospital stay, would not fully meet her eyes for most of the meeting. She understood that he had been told more than he was comfortable repeating. They placed a printed copy of the anonymous letter on the table between them, unsigned, the postmark from a shipping store 2 blocks from Cole Holdings' offices. None of them mentioned the postmark out loud, though all 3 of them clocked it. She answered every question with the same flat precision she brought to a model review, and she did not cry, and she did not raise her voice. She understood with total clarity that the letter had not been written to get her fired. It had been written to be entered into a custody file as evidence that even her employer had concerns. Preston's lawyer requested a copy of the compliance meeting minutes 2 days later, faster than Naomi had told anyone at Ashcombe outside that room. It told her more clearly than any account freeze had exactly how far the reach into her life now extended. She began after that checking her office for anything out of place before she sat down each morning, a habit that felt paranoid at first. It stopped feeling paranoid the day she found a visitor badge log showing an unfamiliar name had accessed the floor after hours. The same week the letter arrived. She wrote the name down, a name that matched no one on Ashcombe's directory, and added it to the notebook without yet knowing what it meant. She trusted that unexplained facts had a way of explaining themselves, eventually, if she simply kept collecting them. That night, for the first time since the petition landed on her keyboard, Naomi allowed herself 10 minutes of sitting on her bathroom floor with the door locked. Then she got up, washed her face, and went back to the folder. The name resurfaced on a Thursday in February in an internal Ashcombe memo about a client conflict check, 3 words in a routine paragraph. Ann Capital Partners listed as the majority lender of record on Cole Holdings' senior credit facility as of the prior October. Naomi read the sentence twice, then a third time, because the timeline did not sit right. October was 14 months before the Friday night Preston had dropped the petition on her keyboard, which meant whoever held that debt had held it since before any of this started. The memo itself concerned an unrelated client, and Naomi would have skimmed past the reference entirely if the name had not already been sitting in her notebook for 3 weeks by then, unexplained. She did not recognize the fund by name, and she had no reason to connect it to a due diligence room, 5 years old, a room she had not thought about in longer than she would have admitted. She searched the fund's name that night alone at her kitchen table and found little beyond a sparse website and a Chicago address 2 miles from her own office. The website listed a short set of portfolio sectors that included freight without naming a single company. There was no photograph of the managing partner, no interview, no profile in any of the trade publications she normally skimmed for work. Only a state filing listing a single officer, Julian Hahn. The name meant nothing to her that night, filed away, the way most names in a database were, one more fact in a folder that was growing heavier by the week. A small, unexamined part of her noted that it was at least an easy name to remember. What she did understand with the cold clarity she reserved for numbers that refused to make sense was that someone with real leverage over her husband's company had been sitting on it for over a year. She intended to find out who, and she added the fund's name to her notebook in the column reserved for facts she could not yet explain. It was the last entry she made in that notebook before the season turned, and though she did not know it yet, it was also the entry that would matter most. Julian learned Naomi's married name during a routine quarterly review of Hahn Capital's credit portfolio, when an analyst flagged Cole Holdings for a compliance letter filed against a Naomi Cole at her employer. The filing had crossed a public compliance database by mistake. He read the analyst's summary twice before he understood what he was looking at, that the woman from a due diligence room 5 years earlier had become Naomi Cole. The company sitting on his own fund's watch list for covenant violations belonged to her husband. He did not call her, and he did not mention it to the analyst beyond a short instruction to keep the file on his desk going forward. The last thing he intended to become was a man who inserted himself into a woman's life because he had once found her impressive in a room at 2 in the morning. He sat with the file longer than the covenant numbers alone required, reading the compliance letter's date against the custody filing's date. He understood without needing anyone to explain it what kind of pressure a woman like Naomi was likely under. He had seen enough leveraged companies dress up a personal grievance as a professional concern to recognize the shape of it from 2 data points alone. Instead, he read the covenant file the way he read every file, looking for what was actually there rather than what he expected to find. What he found was a debt-to-earnings ratio that had been quietly out of compliance for 3 straight quarters, concealed by a reclassified expense line any competent auditor should have caught. He asked for the original loan agreement, the one Hahn Capital had bought 14 months earlier as a straightforward yield play on a mid-sized freight company, and confirmed what he already suspected. The change of control clause had been sitting there unused the entire time. The clause ran 3 paragraphs standard language his own legal team had drafted for dozens of similar facilities, the kind of boilerplate that sat quietly in a filing cabinet until the exact set of conditions it described actually occurred. Julian read it twice anyway, the way he read every document that was about to matter, because boilerplate only stayed boilerplate until someone needed it to be something else. Hahn Capital's position was not new, and it was not secret. The fund had held a senior secured stake in Cole Holdings' primary credit facility since the prior October. $4,182,600 purchased at a discount because the freight sector had been unfashionable that year, and Julian had thought the company undervalued on its assets alone. The loan agreement contained a standard change of control provision triggered automatically if the borrower's debt-to-earnings ratio breached its covenant for more than 2 consecutive quarters without cure. Cole Holdings had breached it for 3 and had hidden the breach by moving a recurring insurance expense into a one-time charge category. The maneuver delayed the trigger but did not erase the underlying number once someone pulled the unadjusted filings. Julian had his team rebuild the ratio from raw statements, going back 2 years, the same exercise Naomi had run independently without either of them knowing. The other had reached the same conclusion. The rebuilt numbers showed the breach had actually begun a full quarter earlier than the filed reports admitted. It meant Cole Holdings' finance team, not just its outside doctor, had been managing the story for longer than anyone outside the company understood. Julian did not need to threaten anyone, freeze an account, or contact a single regulator. All he needed to do was decline to grant the routine covenant waiver his legal team had drafted as a courtesy the previous month, a waiver Cole Holdings' finance team was still waiting on, assuming it a formality. Vanessa had emailed Hand Capital's servicing desk twice that February, asking for confirmation the waiver would clear before quarter end. Both emails answered with the same polite non-committal line that the request remained under standard review. He instructed his general counsel to let the waiver expire on its stated deadline the second Friday in March. At that point, the loan agreement's own language, not Julian, would convert the breach into an event of default and hand Han Capital the right to convert its debt position into a controlling equity stake. It took his legal team 11 days to confirm the mechanism was airtight because Julian had learned that leverage used carelessly was leverage wasted, and he intended to use this once cleanly and be finished. He did not tell his own investment committee the personal reason behind the timing, only that Cole Holdings represented an attractive control opportunity at a discount, a memo that was strictly speaking entirely true. Diane Hand called on a Sunday, as she did most Sundays, and asked in Korean when her son intended to stop working through his weekends and start giving her grandchildren instead of quarterly reports. Julian answered her in English, as he always did on this particular subject, and let the silence that followed do the work an argument would have done less politely. His older brother had taken over their father's shipping business 12 years earlier and run it into a restructuring within 6. Julian had spent much of his 20s being told gently, and then not gently, that he was the son who should have been first in line for that responsibility. He had refused it once at 26 in a conversation with his father that ended with his father setting down his chopsticks and not picking them back up for the rest of the meal. Julian had built Hand Capital afterward partly to prove the refusal had been a decision and not a failure. His father had not spoken to him for the better part of a year after that dinner, and by the time the silence broke, both of them had quietly agreed never to revisit the subject directly again. Diane still called him by the name on his birth certificate, sometimes the one almost no one at the fund had ever heard, and he never corrected her. There were exactly 2 people left who used that name, and he was not in a hurry to lose either one. He still took his shoes off at her door out of habit, a small ritual from a childhood he otherwise rarely mentioned. He lined them neatly against the wall the way she had taught him before he could tie the laces himself. She kept a small shelf in her kitchen with a photograph of his father, a bowl of rice set beside it every morning out of habit rather than ceremony. She had asked Julian more than once whether he intended to keep the tradition once she was no longer there to keep it for him. She asked him before hanging up whether there was anyone he was seeing, and he told her he was working, which was true, and which she heard correctly as an answer to a different question entirely. Julian arranged to be at the same industry roundtable. Naomi attended that march not by design, so much as by the ordinary overlap of Chicago's finance circuit. He recognized her before she saw him, the same posture from the due diligence room, spine, straight pen moving before the speaker finished a sentence. He did not approach her during the coffee break, choosing instead to watch her ask the panel's moderator a question about covenant enforcement timelines that made 2 people at the next table stop talking to listen. Her question was specific enough that the moderator had to admit he did not know the answer without checking a small, satisfying moment Julian recognized because he had caused a handful of them himself over the years. She noticed him afterward across the room, and something in her expression shifted for exactly as long as it took her to place his face. Then she nodded once the way people nod at someone from a life they had filed away. He did not go over, and she did not either, and both of them understood without a word passing between them that whatever this was, it was not yet the moment for it. What Julian carried out of that room instead was a fact he had not expected to need. The woman fighting a custody case dressed up as a psychiatric concern was the same woman who could read a covenant filing faster than most of his own analysts. Whatever evidence she was building would not need his help so much as his patience. In April, Naomi cross-referenced Dr. Lang's billing codes against Cole Holdings' corporate card statements. A records request she filed through Maya's guardian ad litem under the pretense of verifying insurance coverage. The guardian ad litem, a family court appointee named Patricia Osei, had been assigned to the case 3 months earlier and had so far given no indication of which parent she found more credible. Naomi had learned to treat that neutrality as an asset rather than a frustration. The dates lined up with a precision that felt less like coincidence and more like a schedule. 5 payments from a Cole Holdings expense account to Dr. Lang's practice, each one logged 2 days before a session date that later appeared in the psychological evaluation as clinical observation. $28,750 total run through a line item labeled consulting services, the same line item Naomi had once flagged in an entirely unrelated company for concealing exactly this kind of payment. Each payment came in an odd amount. Never a round number, the kind of pattern she recognized from her own work as an attempt to make a transaction look like a genuine invoice rather than a scheduled arrangement. She built the comparison herself, a simple table dates on one axis, dollar amounts on the other. She did not need anyone to explain to her what a judge would see in it, because she had built the same kind of table professionally for 6 years. Just never about her own life. Naomi's attorney filed a subpoena that same week for Cole Holdings' full banking record standard procedure in a custody dispute involving allegations of concealed assets. The filing cited Naomi's own comparison table as supporting grounds, the first time in 11 months that a document she had built herself would carry weight inside the case rather than sitting privately in a folder. What neither Naomi nor her attorney yet knew was that the bank Cole Holdings used for its operating account was the same bank processing the covenant waiver expiration, and Capital's legal team had quietly let lapse 11 days earlier. The two filings were about to collide in the same courtroom. The mediation was scheduled for the second Friday in March in a conference room on the 32nd floor of the same Wacker Drive tower where Naomi had read the petition 11 months earlier. The building's management company had renovated the lobby since then, new marble, new directory screens, though. The elevators still ran on the same delay. Naomi remembered a 4-second pause before the doors closed. The table was the same kind of glass, long enough to seat 12, and Naomi sat at it now with her attorney on one side and a folder on the other. It was the same folder she had built one entry at a time since the night a page fell out of a printer tray. She had transferred every note from the handwritten notebook into it over the previous weekend, checking each date one final time against its source before letting the paper version go. Preston arrived 12 minutes late with Vanessa waiting outside in the hallway, a detail his own attorney had not authorized and would later regret. He took the seat across from Naomi with the loose, settled posture of a man who had never once considered losing. His attorney opened a leather folio and arranged 3 copies of the same brief across the table, a habit meant to project preparation. Naomi recognized it from years of client meetings as a substitute for preparation rather than evidence of it. Outside the window, 41 floors below, a courier was already logging into the building's security desk with a sealed envelope from Cole Holdings' bank. It was time-stamped 8 minutes after the covenant waiver deadline had lapsed the previous Friday. Naomi's folder sat closed in front of her pale blue cover sheets, squared to the edge of the table, the same formatting discipline she brought to every quarterly review she had ever submitted at Ashcombe. She had not slept more than 4 hours a night for most of the preceding week, though nothing in her posture suggested it because she had learned long ago that composure was itself a kind of evidence. Preston opened by telling the mediator in the easy tone of a man reciting something he had said many times before, that Naomi's condition had been documented by a licensed professional. He said the firm had its own concerns about her judgment and that a child needed stability more than she needed a mother who could not provide it. He spoke for nearly 6 minutes without referring once to notes of fluency that came. Naomi understood from months of rehearsal rather than conviction. It was the same fluency she had watched him bring to boardroom pitches early in their marriage, back when he still asked her opinion on the wording beforehand. He did not raise his voice because he had never needed to, and he glanced at Naomi only once while he said it, the same glance he had given her 11 months earlier. It was the look of a man checking whether his words had landed where he aimed them. Naomi's attorney let him finish without interrupting, and Naomi herself said nothing at all. She had learned across 8 years that silence in that room was not surrender. It was simply patience with better posture. Preston's attorney added a final point that Ashcombe's own compliance office had opened an internal inquiry into Naomi's conduct, a fact he presented as independent corroboration without mentioning who had triggered that inquiry or when. The mediator made a note of it without comment, the particular kind of note that gave away nothing about which way she was leaning. Naomi's attorney would later tell her once they were back on the elevator that the mediator's silence in that moment had already told them everything they needed to know. Preston, mistaking her stillness for defeat, one final time allowed himself a small, satisfied breath before the mediator turned to Naomi's side of the table. Naomi's attorney opened the folder and set 3 documents on the glass, one at a time. Each one turned so Preston could read the header before she spoke. The first was a calendar comparison, 5 session dates from Dr. Lange's evaluation set beside 5 records placing Naomi somewhere else entirely. A conference badge scan, a boarding pass, a hotel folio, each highlighted in the same shade of yellow Naomi used on every model she had ever built. The mediator studied the first page for longer than protocol strictly required, running one finger down the column of dates, the way a person double-checks a total they already suspect is correct. The second was a billing statement from Cole Holdings' corporate account. 5 payments to Dr. Lang's practice totaling $28,750. Each one logged 48 hours before a session date that did not exist on Naomi's calendar. The third document was the subpoenaed bank record delivered that morning, showing the same payments routed through an account Vanessa Kirk had opened under a variation of the practice's name 6 months earlier. A courier downstairs had confirmed the account's existence less than an hour before the meeting began. The account had been opened at a different bank than the one Cole Holdings normally used, a small precaution that had worked for 6 months. It failed the moment a subpoena reached past the obvious paperwork into the correspondent transfers behind it. Naomi's attorney turned the final page so the routing number faced Preston directly and let it sit there for a moment before speaking again. Preston looked at the third document longer than the first two combined, and something in his face changed in a way it had not changed once in 11 months. He had been told by Vanessa that the account had been closed and the trail with it. Naomi's attorney walked the table through it in the order Naomi had built its statistics first. The near impossibility of 5 clinical session dates lining up by chance with 5 days. Naomi could independently prove she was elsewhere, a probability her own analysis put below 1 in several thousand. She had run the calculation the same way she ran any confidence interval at work, conservatively rounding every assumption in the direction least favorable to her own case. A number that survived its own skepticism was the only kind worth bringing into a room like this one. Then documents, the billing statement and the bank record laid side by side, showing a financial relationship between Cole Holdings and Dr. Lang's practice, never once disclosed to the court, to compliance, or to Naomi herself. Then, last, an audio file, a voicemail. Vanessa had left for Dr. Lang's office manager 8 months earlier, recovered through the subpoena because the practice's call service retained recordings for a full year as routine policy. Neither Vanessa nor Dr. Lang had thought to request its deletion because neither of them had known until that morning that a subpoena could reach a call service's back end rather than only the practice's own files. The recording ran 41 seconds, and Vanessa's voice was clear through every word of it. Make sure the next report says volatility, not stress. They want it to read like a diagnosis, not an opinion. Preston sat very still through all 41 seconds, and Naomi watched something settle over his face that she recognized from exactly one other moment in their marriage. It was the specific stillness of a man realizing in real time that a plan he had trusted completely had been built on a foundation someone else forgot to secure. His attorney reached for the recording's transcript to object to its admissibility. The mediator reminded him evenly that both parties had agreed to informal evidentiary standards for this session, precisely to avoid the delay a formal objection would now cause. The objection died on the table unfinished, the way most objections in that room tended to when the underlying fact was no longer in dispute. He had believed, because Vanessa told him so, that the account was closed and the calls untraceable. He had walked into that room as certain of victory as he had been 11 months earlier on the 41st floor, unaware that the certainty itself had never once been checked. It was, Naomi thought, watching him, the exact mistake she had spent 6 years teaching junior analysts, never to make trusting a number because a confident person had said it out loud. Preston's attorney asked for a short recess, and the mediator granted 5 minutes. Though everyone in the room understood the recess would not change what the documents already showed. He spent most of it standing by the window with his back to the table, the same posture Naomi remembered from every difficult phone call he had ever taken at home. He faced away, so no one could read what his face was doing. Vanessa, waiting in the hallway, was not told what had happened until Preston walked out to find her, and the look on his face told her before any words did. 11 months earlier, on a dark floor, 41 stories above where they now sat, Preston had told her she was a calculator that learned to breathe. The mediator, reading aloud from the transcript of Naomi's written statement into the record, repeated the line, back into the room, exactly as Naomi had written it down that same night on her phone. This time, everyone at the table heard it, including the court reporter whose fingers paused on the keys for the length of a full breath before continuing. Naomi did not flinch at hearing her own worst night read back to her. The calculator, it turned out, had spent 11 months doing the one thing calculators were built to do, and the numbers had not lied to her once. The mediator suspended the session and referred the psychological evaluation to the family court for independent review. Under state procedure, the referral automatically stayed the temporary custody order Preston had been granted 11 months earlier, pending a new assessment by a court-appointed evaluator. Naomi's attorney requested and the mediator granted an expedited timeline for that reassessment, given the evidentiary record now on file. Preston's attorney did not contest it, having run out of grounds to contest much of anything by that point in the afternoon. Dr. Lang's practice received notice from the state medical board within the week, opening a formal inquiry into the billing records, now part of the court file. His attorney warned him the process could take the better part of a year and would very likely end his license regardless of the custody outcome. Dr. Lang closed his private practice that same month rather than wait for the board's decision, a choice. His malpractice carriers counsel recommended as the fastest way to limit further exposure. Vanessa's attorney advised her separately, and within the same week that the wire transfers connected to the account she had opened could expose her personally to a fraud referral, a possibility her employment contract's indemnification clause did nothing to cover. She resigned from Cole Holdings before that referral could be filed, a timing her own attorney later described carefully as prudent rather than voluntary. 2 floors below the mediation room, unrelated in the moment but not in its timing, Cole Holdings' banking team received formal notice that the covenant waiver had expired without renewal. It triggered the change of control provision in the senior credit agreement, converting Han Capital's debt position into a controlling equity stake of 71% effective immediately. The notice arrived through the same channels Julian's legal team had used for every routine filing over the past year. Nothing dramatic in its delivery, a certified letter and a wire confirmation. It was the kind of paperwork that ended companies without ever raising its voice. Preston learned about the second notice from his own general counsel 40 minutes after leaving the mediation room. Reading it twice standing in a parking garage, he understood he had lost his daughter's case and his company's board seat inside the same single Friday. He called his father that night for the first time in over a year, a call that lasted 4 minutes and ended without either of them raising the subject of Naomi Maya or the company at all. Naomi's attorney received formal confirmation the following Monday that the temporary asset freeze on the joint savings account had been lifted by court order. It restored her access to $214,600 she had not touched in 5 months. The order also required Preston to release the trust established for Maya, $186,400, into a custodial account naming Naomi as sole trustee until Maya turned 18. She transferred her own savings that same afternoon into the account she had opened alone in a parking lot the previous November and closed the joint account permanently. The whole process took 15 minutes, considerably less time than anything else that year had. By June, the family court's independent evaluator had filed a report, finding no basis for the original psychiatric concerns restoring Naomi's full custody rights. The evaluator's report ran 22 pages and addressed point by point each of the 5 disputed session dates, concluding that the original evaluation had been, in the evaluator's own words, entered into the record constructed rather than observed. The report referred Dr. Lang's original evaluation to the State Attorney General's office for review, alongside the medical board inquiry already underway. Vanessa Kirk resigned from Cole Holdings before the board could vote on her termination and left the state within a month. Han Capital's incoming ownership group required her to sign over any remaining equity she held as a condition of her severance. Preston kept a minority stake in the company he had once run alone, a position that came with a seat at quarterly meetings he was no longer required or particularly welcome to speak much at. He attended the first 2 meetings anyway and skipped the third, and no one on the new board followed up to ask why. The new board seated by Han Capital that April brought in an outside operator to run Cole Holdings day-to-day, a logistics executive with no history with either Preston or Naomi. It suited everyone left in the room just fine. Ashcom Partners promoted Naomi to lead a newly created credit risk unit that August built almost entirely around a methodology she had developed on her own time. The framework cross-referenced billing and calendar records to flag exactly the kind of concealed related party payment that had nearly cost her a daughter. The firm began licensing an early version of it to 2 other funds by the end of the year, and internally people had started calling it simply the Reeves method, a name Naomi never asked for and never corrected. Naomi found herself for the first time in longer than she could remember being paid specifically for the way her mind refused to accept a number until she had checked what it was built from. The unit's first hire, after Yvonne was a data engineer who had spent 3 years at a regional bank flagging exactly the kind of reclassified expense that had almost cost Naomi her daughter. It was a hire Naomi made without needing to explain to anyone why the skill mattered to her personally. Yvonne Marsh, who had left granola bars on her desk without comment for the better part of a year, became the first person Naomi hired onto the new team, and neither of them ever discussed why. They did eventually start eating lunch together again at an actual table, though the stairwell habit took months to fully break. Robert, the compliance officer who had once struggled to meet her eyes in that 40-minute meeting, sent her a short note when the promotion was announced, 4 sentences, no apology in it. Both of them understood it functioned as one anyway. On a Sunday in late autumn, almost exactly a year after the petition had landed on her keyboard, Naomi stood in the kitchen of a new apartment on the near north side. Late afternoon light came low through a window that faced west, and she watched Maya count coins into stacks of 10 across the counter. The apartment had come with a leak in the bathroom ceiling. The landlord still hadn't fixed, and a radiator that clanked twice every hour on the hour. These were small imperfections Naomi had stopped noticing within the first month because the quiet underneath them was worth more than either flaw cost her. Maya was learning to round numbers for a school project, and she frowned at a stack that came up short, recounting it twice before looking up at her mother for confirmation that 7 was in fact still 7. Naomi confirmed it, then showed her a faster way to check the total without recounting from the start, the same trick she had taught a dozen junior analysts over the years. Though she did not say that part out loud. Maya swept the confirmed stacks into a jar labeled in her own handwriting, savings. A jar Naomi had bought her the week they moved in without any particular lesson in mind, though one seemed to be taking root anyway. Maya asked without looking up from the coins whether Daddy would be at her school thing next month. Naomi answered the question the way she had learned to answer most of Maya's questions since March, plainly without editorial yes on the days it was his turn. The apartment was smaller than the house she had shared with Preston, and it held in its quiet, ordinary way more of what she had actually wanted than the house ever had. A table with no one watching, how she poured anything, a refrigerator with a drawing. Maya had made taped crookedly to the door. 3 stick figures under a sun with too many rays labeled in Maya's careful handwriting. Mommy Maya, and a 3rd figure Maya had labeled simply us. A small white box arrived by courier that same week, unsigned, containing rice cakes from a bakery on the north side, known for a particular red bean filling. It was the kind of gift sent traditionally to mark good news rather than to open a conversation. No return address, no note, just the shop's plain paper wrapping, and a rubber band holding the lid shut, the kind of small restraint Naomi recognized without being able to say exactly why. Naomi did not need the card to know who had sent it because Yvonne had mentioned weeks earlier running into a familiar face at a credit conference downtown. A man who had asked in passing how the case had turned out and said nothing else. She set the box on the counter and let Maya pick one out first, and did not that evening write back. She kept the empty box anyway, rinsed and dried on the top shelf of a cabinet. She rarely opened, for reasons she did not examine too closely and did not need to. It sat there through the winter and then through the spring after that, and she never once threw it away, though she never once mentioned it to anyone either. Somewhere tonight, someone is being told they are worth exactly what a man decided to write on a piece of paper. The story, Naomi would tell them if she could, is not that the number was wrong. It is that a number only means what the person holding it can prove. If this reached you at the hour, it was meant to tell us your city. And if a table has ever tried to convince you that silence meant you had already lost, remember that some of the quietest people in the room are the ones counting everything.